picture a tool chain or a toolkit where you can very easily define your structure for content. Within the structure, you will use Markdown, for example, and then you can run that structure against the validator. So in that case, you would be a company that is creating some standardized Markdown structure for your documentation that you could check afterwards, but without any assumption as to what is the right structure.
Hey folks, my name is Nick, and I'm one of the founders of Doctave. Now, I had the chance to sit down with Fabrizio Ferri Benedetti to talk about a really interesting topic, which is Markdown and Structured Authoring. Now, this is a topic that I myself and Doctave as a company has been interested in for a while, namely, how can we bring some of the really powerful features from structured authoring frameworks like DITA and DocBook into a Markdown and Docs as code context. Now, Fabrizio is a principal technical writer at Splunk and just a really thoughtful voice in the technical writing community. It was really great to have him share his opinions on this topic and see what he had to say. Now, if you're not familiar with Doctave, we are a documentation platform focusing on Docs as code. So we take care of all the pipelines and deployments and hosting of your documentation so that you can focus on what's actually important, which is, of course, your content itself. And if you're interested to learn more, you can find us at doctave.com. But without further ado, I give you Fabrizio and our discussion about Markdown and structured authoring. Hope you enjoy. Fabrizio, thanks very much for joining me. So today we're going to be talking about Markdown and structured authoring. This is kind of inspired by some discussions and blog posts that have been in the technical writing community over the past few months. Maybe to start off, Fabrizio, could you introduce yourself and maybe talk about your journey into technical writing and what you do these days?
Yeah, so I've been writing in tech companies since 2008, approximately. And currently I'm a principal technical writer. I'm also an open source docs contributor. And I've been dabbling in technical writing since, 2015, more or less. Before that, I was, writing other things like doing reviews for software and blog posts, and then I transitioned into progressively more technical content. And I'm quite vocal about technical writing and the value of technical writing. My blog is passo.uno, and I'm glad to have this chat with you. It's Markdown and its evolution and its limitations is a topic that is very dear to my heart due to all the content migrations I had to do in the past that I'm still doing. So yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So to be more concrete, you were on a really interesting panel discussion a few months ago called "The Pros and Cons of Using Markdown for Technical Documentation." It had Ed Marsh, Eric Hulscher, yourself, and it was hosted by Scott Abel, I believe.
Yes.
There was some really interesting discussions there about exactly the pros and cons of Markdown. In a technical writing context, because of course it's such a popular standard, but in some cases it leaves a lot to be desired in terms of structured authoring and sort of these really powerful technical writing tool chains like DITA and so forth. Right. So I guess which kind of then prompted me to then write this blog post about how we could maybe take some of these structured authoring concepts and maybe bring them into Markdown, hopefully even a kind of a layered approach where you could sort of gradually grow into something more structured and have bring sanity into into Markdown itself. So maybe to kick this off, I mean, maybe actually before, maybe we should do some definitions. I mean, can we talk about what is actually structured authoring in the first place? And actually, maybe could you talk about your own experience? I mean, if you've used systems like DITA or DocBook or these sorts of things as well.
Well, I've been using DocBook in the past, and now I'm taking on DITA at work. Although previously I've been doing Docs as code mostly. With restructure text, which is interesting. Similar to ASCII doc, you get some semantics, a little more structure in documentation. But it's restructure text, ASCII doc, even some Markdown versions are still nowhere near the power of DITA, say, or even DocBook, in the sense of enabling structured authoring. And by structured authoring here, we are referring to creating documentation in a way that allows content reuse, that allows multi-channel publishing, and it takes lots of metadata, lots of semantic markup to get there. It's true that yeah, having Markdown with structure is a dream, right? I mean, at least for some. But we have to be careful not to turn into a nightmare also in terms of editing experience.
Yes.
And I think, in that panel, what came out is that Markdown really lowers the bar to contribution. Like anyone can type some Markdown, and that's the magic of it. And Markdown is everywhere. Any editor, any application has some kind of support for Markdown, which is not the same situation for the structured authoring markup languages that are out there, at least yet. And part of that success is really due to the simplicity. So the challenge is, how do you keep that simplicity, right, and that immediacy, while at the same time bringing some of those structured authoring affordances to Markdown, right? And perhaps the question for me would be, who's gonna need that, right? Do you have like a picture in mind when you wrote the blog post?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. Of course, like I'm coming at this from Doctave's perspective, and and maybe I could talk a little bit about my sort of history and our history as a company of building this Docs as Code platform, which is when we originally created the first version of Doctave. For us, it was very much a thing of we needed to add some sort of templating system into Doctave for basic content reuse and these sorts of things.
Yeah.
And what we ended up selecting was the Liquid template language. There's a number of reasons for that, but it's familiar for anyone who's used Jekyll, for example, as a static site generator. Right. It's the same system. It was developed by Shopify originally, and mainly the benefit is that it's a safe templating system, which allows us as a kind of hosting provider to use it safely. But there's a number of problems with it, namely that. Well, I guess I go into we can maybe come back to this later, but the templating, but Jekyll as a templating system doesn't actually work very well with Markdown. So what I sort of realized was that, you'd have to have some sort of templating system, or some sort of, well, it doesn't have to be a templating system necessarily, but some sort of system that actually understands Markdown is not a general sort of string manipulation template system. Instead, it's something that understands the structure of Markdown deeply, and maybe in a way you could start annotating stuff onto it as well. There's of course interesting history around this. I think Eric on the panel discussion, he sort of mentioned that CommentMark tried to go down this route of actually adding more interesting features and structure to Markdown, and I went actually to the CommentMark discuss server, or is it Discord? No, it's not the Discord. So anyway, but it was the forum that they had, and I went back to these blog posts, these sort of chat logs from, or sort of threads from about 2014, 2015, and they're fascinating. Basically, there's all these questions there about how do we add these arbitrary templating syntax systems, and like how do we get audio and video there and everything. And I guess what happened there was that it just didn't move anywhere, because there were so many competing requirements to actually get it to work, and it just never went anywhere. So I'm not 100% sure, honestly, what the right approach here is. Stripe, of course, has done a really interesting thing with their authoring system called MarkDoc, which is built on top. It's built on Markdown. It does require you to write some JavaScript, and it's sort of tied very directly into the sort of the JavaScript ecosystem. But it's a very interesting example of what this could potentially look like. But I think it's I'm not 100% sure exactly, honestly, what the right way forward here is. Like, maybe we just need more experiments.
I don't know, like any big company with sufficient resources like Stripe, can roll out their own variant of, say, Markdown with, enriched in their case, it's enriched with with MDX, if I remember correctly, and other kind of annotations that they are parsed by their own library. The problem is, how do you get that to become a standard? And well, that's complicated. I feel like the only markup that because Markdown is we brought as this is not standardized really, and it's quite prevalent. There's a sort of an agreement on what the lingua franca looks like for all systems, but then you have different ways of doing tables, different ways sometimes of referencing some of the documents, and that seems to be working more or less fine for the developer community. But then the writers, we appreciate some sort of standardization around things. The DITA approach to this, which was interestingly enabled by XML, is using schemas and DTDs. So you start with a core markup language that has the essential topic types and the essential elements, and you define the rules that, like, for example, this topic type can only contain these elements. And all that goes into a schema that you can parse, you can validate against, and then you can specialize. And that's a very interesting notion in the DITA world is specialization. I was wondering, I think any effort to expand Markdown beyond the current situation and make it like more suitable to structured authoring would require some sort of ancillary mechanism similar to DITA's. Like, it could be a JSON schema, it could be some sort of YAML scaffolding structure somewhere, and it would perhaps get even more similar to what is the open API authoring experience these days, where you have a schema that defines where the elements can go and what they can contain and in what order. And then within those elements, you can use Markdown, like doing the proper formatting and authoring. So picture, I'm just like, thinking out loud here, full brainstorming mode, but picture some sort of format similar to YAML, where you would be structuring, following a schema, the document, and have Markdown within the document in the places where you would like to edit. It would not be that different from doing XML and then having like some HTML formatting elements within those elements. The problem is, I don't know, YAML, well, perhaps it wouldn't have to be YAML. It could be JSON with a UI on top, for example. But I think the core issue here is like having some sort of single source of truth for the structure you want to achieve. And, I
was wondering, could we, like, because this is you're bringing about a really interesting question of this, like, what's the mechanism through which you can actually enforce structure onto Markdown? But before that, could you give an example, like a real world example of a situation where DITA really shines like this, where having this sort of structure is like essential and really big, has a big help? Because if you're working on like a small open source project that has like maybe tens of documents, the benefits might not be as clear as for some other projects.
There's a couple situations where, top of my mind, where I think DITA or DocBook shine. And it's, for example, one is unlimited content reuse. Like, you have an element with an ID and you can reuse that element anywhere. It's true that, languages like restructured text have these include mechanism, but it's way more primitive in the sense that it's completely file based, and I would say it's less flexible in a way. But it could be somehow, it could be copied somehow, but for that you need some sort of ID system. See, there's already a layer of complexity here. The other thing that I really enjoy about structured authoring is the use of variables. In the case, for example, you want to show different content depending on the audience. And perhaps software documentation hasn't gotten to the level of complexity yet. Manufacturing, for sure, because we are talking about like products with tens of variants that you have to document, right? And in that scenario, it makes sense to use variables heavily. But it really makes you wonder, if we wanted to enter that market using Markdown because people is familiar with it, how can we achieve the same thing, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. What about the sort of actually the schema case that you brought up? Do you have experiences in your career where you had like very specific schemas that you were enforcing for a certain set of documents or something like this?
Well, we are in the process of doing that at work.
Okay.
But the situation is that you might have some content patterns in wherever you're working. You might have standardized maybe around some, let's say, what a task is or what a troubleshooting topic looks like. And DITA provides like very basic out-of-the-box content types like task reference and troubleshooting also, if I remember correctly. But you can specialize that, like you can create your own definitions of your topic and how that should look like and what elements it should contain. And that really, enforcing that really allows to preserve consistency across your documentation. You also have things like schematron that is also XML based and allows you to validate the structure of your XML files. But yeah, it's, we're talking about lots of features, and there might be a risk in the attempt of turning Markdown into something more structured, which is feature creep.
Yes.
I think any attempt should start small. Like, what is the core things that we really want? And then perhaps eventually we can expand on a solid base. But like starting with everything might be overwhelming.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Like, you probably do want to have some sort of iterative approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. And yeah, I mean, at Doctave, we recently had like a 2.0 launch, and when we did that, we ended up migrating away from Jekyll into sorry, not Jekyll, Liquid, the Liquid template system, to a homegrown system, which is actually based on, it essentially uses the same rules for parsing the Markdown document as MDX, which already actually breaks compatibility with Common Mark, for example. Yeah. But and this is something we didn't take lightly, but I feel now pretty strongly that that's okay. That you're like, if you're like a Markdown purist about having, and then about like everything having to be perfectly transferable from one system to another, then you're just limiting yourself, and you're not going to be able to, like, even going from like something like MKDocs to DocuSaurus will already probably break things.
I think I think it's okay to encapsulate Markdown in some sort of overlay or structure, whatever you want to call it, provided that the Markdown itself that you're using within those fragments, for example, is easy to edit and it's still the Markdown experience, right? So that's one possible path, is building around Markdown, not changing what Markdown is, because you would end up with something like restructured tests or ASCII doc number 2, which might work, but it hasn't so far in terms of widespread adoption, because you're going to learn like a text notation and decorations convention that might suit you or not, but essentially it changes what Markdown is. So if you want to preserve the core of Common Mark, you really have to build around it in some way.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's sort of a shame that ASCII doc hasn't actually got more popular, or restructured text as well. It's funny, like, every once in a while I get these messages like, when are you going to support ASCII doc? And but unfortunately it's probably not going to be for a while, just because of the well, yeah, our system's not really built for it these days. But I think there's like another universe where ASCII doc gained more popularity, and then
well, that's interesting. That's the interesting thing, right? I mean, if you go for a schema first approach, and again, I'm thinking again of OpenAPI and how it does it. The kind of content you can have within the schema could be anything. Could be ASCII doc, could be restructured text eventually, because you would have the container that defines the content and the formatting eventually.
Right.
You would be limited to that.
Mm.
Yeah, then of course you would have to deal with things like labeling and references. But the scaffolding, the structure that ties all that content together could be universal somehow.
Yeah, actually, I think you hit on a very interesting point, which is that I think that was something that I wrote about in the article I wrote, which is which was titled "The Path to Structured Content in Markdown," which is that Markdown and DITA and actually ASCII doc and restructured text fundamentally, like the structure of the documents that these different formats are describing are almost identical when you sort of squint. And like when you actually go through the effort of transforming, like, because you go through the effort of transforming all of those different systems into, in our case, most of the time HTML, and it's like the same HTML tags come out, you get paragraphs, you get headings, and you get code blocks. And yes, there might be things that kind of get, like, there might be more stylistic things like admonitions or call outs or these sorts of things that also show up. But fundamentally, like, the structure is the same, and these are describing the same information. It's just a question of how do you pull this information together, and then and how do you reuse content, like you say, and then enforce these rules. But I guess theoretically, it could be possible to have a rule system that actually is able to work on all of these different formats. It would be quite a lot of work, but I think it like from a theoretical perspective, it absolutely would work.
Yeah, it's a bit like linguistics in the sense that we live in a polyglot environment.
Yeah.
And tools like Pandoc really
Yes.
try to bridge the gap there. It's a bit like our Google Translate for markup languages.
Absolutely.
And there's always something that gets lost in translation inevitably.
Yeah.
But it would be, Pandoc doesn't make any assumption, I think, on what is the right proper structure for documentation. It's not its task to do that. But I think it would be nice to somehow go into that direction again, also maybe reusing work that has been done already. And I think that the work that has been accomplished for DITA is really worth rescuing somehow, and perhaps reapply that to a Markdown work. There's also lightweight DITA in that.
I was just going to bring that up. Yeah.
So that's an interesting direction as well.
Yeah. It seems though that effort seems to it hasn't been updated for quite a while, so I don't know how alive and well that effort is, but I think that again, it's a really interesting example of bringing Markdown into the structured world of DITA, and because they do that exact thing where they have this mapping layer between, okay, this is a header in Markdown, I can map that into a particular element in the XML structure, and everything just sort of works together nicely, and that's great. But no, that's really interesting. That is really interesting. One thing that I've sort of been thinking about is that do you think that these sort of, because when you look at these like DITA, for example, it's a very complex system, like already. Do you think we'll ultimately actually need all of the features that DITA gives you? Because you have like the XSD schemas where you can literally go and say, I want to have exactly 3 paragraphs inside this particular element, and it has to contain these words and all these sorts of things. So you can go like really, really, really deep into exactly what you need. Do you think that's actually something that people actually use?
Well, there are scenarios where that is used, but to me is more of a question of what are what is the bare minimum you must use in order to be successful within your system or language. And nobody's forcing you to enforce those rules, for example, but you can do it if you want, right? So we are looking potentially for a system where you have that flexibility of being able to enforce those rules, because eventually sometimes that might be a possibility. I think it's very tempting to conflate structured authoring to inflexible documentation. that's not always the case, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it's true that documentation requires consistency, and that is hard to achieve in Markdown environments, and it's hard to enforce, especially in an automatic way. I mean, you can have editors, of course, like people checking and reviewing. Uh, that is always prone to errors, and sometimes something slips through. And in certain sectors, consistent, very structured, highly structured documentation is a must due to compliance and legal requirements, for example, and really want to make sure that that works for them. So, it's the interesting thing also about structured authoring is that you can run those checks automatically. And for any developer, that is interesting because it takes the human away from the equation.
Yes.
And it generates less discussions.
Yes. Yeah, I'm 100% on board that. Like, you want the things that you can, like, sort of programmatically enforce, you should try to programmatically enforce, and you just make that decision ahead of time, and then end of discussion, and hopefully people can just agree that's that these are the rules. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I remember in the panel discussion that you were on, there was a question about, well, how do you actually enforce structure in Markdown? And I think what the panel decided on was that actually the only way to do that right now with Markdown is templates, right? So, and like, you sort of, which is exactly exactly against what we just talked about, where you actually can't enforce that. You have to have a human who actually checks that the template is being used correctly and all these sorts of things.
Yeah, it's kind of a wishful thinking in the sense that I'm releasing these templates out in the world, and I'm hoping they're gonna be used. But then it's really up to you to check whether that is correct or so in that sense, it's not that different from using Microsoft Word or any text editor. There's no assumption on the structure itself. So that's why I keep thinking about having taking a step back. You have the documentation in Markdown, yes, but then you have a schema that is splitting that into parts that you can validate.
Yeah, it is a really interesting question, and I sort of, in the blog post I wrote, I think finished off with sort of saying that we sort of need the three parts, which is, one is you sort of need this parser and system that is able to understand the like the Markdown structure, or maybe whatever other syntax you add on top, whether it's and actually parse it as Markdown, not as strings, because you run into all sorts of weird issues because of Markdown's rules if you do string replacement and all these sorts of things. And we have a couple examples of that. One of them is MarkDoc from Stripe, and the other is the MDX format, which sort of allows you to do this very, very well. So we sort of solve that first part. The second part is then defining those rules, and which is what we're sort of, I guess, coming to, where you need to be able to, I guess it also contains the part of maybe bringing content from different files together and actually building the final document, but then also, then defining and saying this document has to conform to some specific format. Exactly how that is defined is still a little bit unclear. And then you actually need the engine to actually run those rules. But I guess ultimately it would be great if you sort of had, going forward, like a GitHub action that sort of looks at all the different annotations, maybe in some sort of front matter YAML at the top of your Markdown file, that just says, hey, this file has to conform to this tutorial specification that we have over here, and you just get an error and your build fails if it doesn't do that.
That would be a nice scenario, and I think there's an approach that we could take in this area that is different from DITA's. Which is, if you think of tools like the Veil linter, for example, Veil, again, is just a way of defining, rules for style that you can check against using a CLI tool. And it doesn't make, again, any assumption on what the right rules are. It has a very generic endpoints for things like repetition or occurrences. But that is up to you to define what's wrong or what's right. And I think if someone, I don't know, maybe it could be Doctave or someone else, I don't know, but instead of pushing like a schema and something rigid Like, it makes sense for OpenAPI because you are defining a standard there.
Of course.
But instead of pushing something like a task as steps and these must come after an abstract, instead of doing that, because you can write documentation however you want, it would be interesting to have a system that allows you to define these constraints and create those templates and structures, maybe even in a visual way, and then check documentation against those. So it would be similar to Vail conceptually, but picture a tool chain or a toolkit where you can very easily define your structure for content. Within the structure, you would use Markdown, for example.
Yeah.
And then you can run that structure against the validator, right? So in that case, you would be a company that is creating some standardized Markdown structure for your documentation that you could check afterwards, but without any assumption as to what is the right structure.
Yes.
No.
Completely agree. Completely agree. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Doctave is definitely going to be going in this direction. And like one thing that we have sort of thought about long term is open sourcing parts of our sort of parsing engine. So this is not an announcement or anything like that, but I think if we do end up sort of building interesting things here, I think it would be sort of the right thing for us as a business as well, but also just for the industry, I think in general, just to then try and open source those tools because, especially if we're able to sort of get this sort of layered approach where you can start with any sort of basic Markdown dialect, and then you sort of start layering these rules and stuff on top of that. But
that would help, whether you use a UI or do CLI-based validations. I mean,
right.
There are headless CMS out there
yeah.
where you can create content types with fields, for example. I think going the way of the visual form is a bit dangerous in the sense that it's perhaps too focused on the visual itself. Like you have like you want a text box with this character limitation. It should be more about like the semantic side. Like I want an introduction and the kind of field maybe can come later. But I want this kind of content with this order.
Yes.
And then you can have like just a JSON file that points to some sort of Markdown as an include, for example. I don't know what the mechanism could be there, but the risk I see in some headless CMS is that there is too much focus on the presentation again, rather than the semantics. So it should really be focused on the semantics, I think.
Yeah, that is definitely something we've also found. There is this like push and pull always of like people want their docs to look great, and especially if you're doing, like in our case, it's mostly technical documentation and usually on a website, and you want the first landing page on the website to look really nice. You want to have some boxes and sort of grids and all sorts of stuff. So, but yeah, then you're bringing a lot of the kind of the presentation layer into the mix, which I guess is where like the sort of the single sourcing and sort of this topic-based authoring really shines, is that if that's just one particular output of the content that we're going to be pushing out, and there might be a PDF or a manual or something like that we're also doing the same content's being pulled in there. But yeah, that is a very good point though. But yeah, we're starting to come up on time here. So maybe any sort of final words of wisdom before we head out?
Last words of wisdom, I would say, don't obsess too much on the specific markup language you're going to use. Focus first and foremost on your documentation needs and the structure you need to better convey your message to your customers. And then the choice of a markup language or a standard will come naturally.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, there's often a lot of focus on the doc ops instead of the documentation and the content itself. But yeah, no, that makes sense. Hey,
yeah, tools are fun, but sometimes you have to focus on the hard stuff too.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I guess it's and I think a lot of people in the documentation space are sort of tinkerers, and they want to sort of dig in. And
I'm guilty too.
Yeah, so you can easily spend weeks trying to set up the perfect pipeline or documentation system, whatever you want. Yeah. Hey, Fabrizio, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a fantastic conversation, and yeah, I hope to have you again sometime when when
For
you write
sure.
the next interesting blog post, and that'll inspire me to write something else, and then
Certainly.
we can hash it out again.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. It's been a great conversation.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you so much.